All right, how's it going? I'm Brad Diaz, and this is gonna be part 2 of the beginner photography guide. All right. Yeah, just to let you know, I'm not editing this, so if you hear a lot of a lot of staring into space, don't bother me. It's not my problem. It's your problem. Okay, so if you read the title, this is like the second part of the guide. Yeah, so last time we talked about shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, the 3 bullies that really screwed me up when I started out, and I'm pretty sure they are screwing you up right now if you're just starting out with photography, right? Okay, so today, right, we're gonna talk about shutter speed. Okay, we're gonna, like last episode, I kind of explained what the 3 things are. Shutter speed, aperture, ISO. I kind of explained them, but this episode we're focusing on shutter speed and how to use it for what you need in your situations, all that stuff, right? 2 things to bring up before we begin, okay? Obviously, when I talk about, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, I'm talking about cameras that, are able to adjust your settings, right? And, sometimes I don't think phones can really do that. I mean, you could probably find an app or something like that. But for this case, right, for what I'm talking about using a camera. An actual camera. Could be mirrorless, could be a DSLR, doesn't matter. Another thing, okay, and I'm gonna keep saying this in every video that I make for this guide. It doesn't matter what camera you have, okay? I started out with the Nikon D3100. It was a red camera. My dad gave it to me like a bunch of years ago. It was pretty garbage. Compared to what I have now, it's trash. But, and I'm gonna say this, it doesn't matter what camera or what equipment you have, as long as you know its limitations and its capabilities and how to use it to the fullest extent. That's what matters, because that is what will make you a good photographer. So if you're thinking about upgrading your camera, even though you don't understand photography, don't do it. Okay, if you have like an old camera, just use it. Use it. Be grateful you have that, okay? And once you understand the limitations of your older cameras, then you can upgrade. But we'll talk about that eventually, right? Yeah, so if you just want to know what my camera is, I got an A7 III with the 35mm 1.8. And I probably will explain all of that in a different video, okay? Anyway, so shutter speed. We're talking about shutter speed today. So if you watched the last video, I explained kind of pretty much what shutter speed means, but I'll just review again, you know what I'm saying? So in our cameras, right, in a DSLR mirrorless camera, usually these cameras have sensors, okay? In the back of the camera, let me open up mine. They have sensors, right? You see that thing in there? That's a sensor, okay? So what these sensors do, by the way, don't just open up your camera like that. You might drop your lens, you might get some dust in there. Don't do what I just did, okay? So yeah, so these sensors, we use them in our camera so that they can pick up light and create images from what we shoot, right? So imagine my fingers are a sensor, right? If I expose this to light, okay, if I expose my fingers to light or the sensor to light, what's gonna happen is the light is gonna hit the sensor and it's gonna create the image, okay? Don't ask me the sciencey and tech stuff, I don't know. But that's essentially how it works, okay? Now, there's obviously a problem with keeping our sensor exposed to light all the time. Why? Because if we expose our camera to too much light, the image we're gonna have, I'll show you right now, and I'll set my shutter speed to 2 seconds, right? And I'll explain what's wrong with this, okay? The image we're gonna have is gonna be pretty much white. It's gonna be overexposed, okay? That's what I'm talking about, all right? Excuse me if I start burping. It's just a thing I do. So, when we're using our sensor and when we're taking photos using a DSLR, mirrorless camera, we want to have a shutter, okay? We want to have a specific amount of light hitting our sensor, because if we have too much light entering into our camera, We're gonna have white images. They're not gonna come out good. It's not gonna be sharp, you know, things like that, right? So that's where my baby, the shutter, I don't know why I just called it a baby, whatever. That's where the shutter comes in. That's where the shutter comes in. It's one of the most important things, one of the most important parts of the camera. Don't break it. Just don't break it, okay? So, the shutter, right? Let me explain this. Imagine this hand is a shutter, all right? It's gonna be in front of the sensor. When I hit the button, and I'm like, let's say 1/200th of a second, right? I am going to open and close the shutter in 1/200th of a second, right? Like that, right? Very quickly, I am letting in, as I'm opening it, a small amount of light into the camera and hitting the sensor, right? You see the light hitting, then I close. That's what the shutter does, okay? So if I have, you know, a 2-second time or 2-second shutter speed, what's gonna happen is my shutter is gonna open for 2 seconds, let 2 seconds of light hit the sensor, then close. Okay, you get that? So, you know, when it says 10-second shutter speed, what it's saying is the shutter is going to be up and letting light hit the sensor for 10 seconds, right? The same goes for 1/100th of a second, which is pretty quick. 1/1000th of a second, which is even quicker. 1/2000th, 1/4000th, 1/8000th. I know I'm rambling numbers, but this is important to keep in mind, right? Because these shutter speeds have different effects on your images, okay? Obviously, first effect is the amount of light you're letting in, okay? If you close your shutter speed very quickly, so if you have like a shutter speed of 1/1000th, 1/2000th, right? What's gonna happen, of a second, what's gonna happen is you're letting in a super small amount of light. Super small amount of light. Let me take a photo right now at 1/1000th of a second, and I'll show you right now, okay? Of my window, right? You hear how quick that was? Like that. That was the shutter just taking a photo like that, right? Very quick if you heard it. I'll take it again. Listen. Hear that? That was 1/1000th of a second. The shutter was open for that short of a time, right? So such a small amount of light was entering the camera. Now look at the image. I don't know if you can see it that well, but pretty much, it's pretty much dark except for the window, right? It's pretty much dark except for the window, okay? That's because we let in a very small amount of light into the camera and hit the sensor, okay? So, there you go. Now, of course, we can also do it for very long periods of time. You know, we could do it for 1/10 of a second, which, look, it may sound very quick, 1/10 of a second, but 1/10 of a second, it lets a lot of light into our camera, and it has some problems when we shoot at 1/10 of a second and above, right? And I will explain those to you in a bit, okay? So, just remember, okay, when you have a very quick shutter speed, you know, 1/100th of a second, 1/200th of a second, 1/1000th of a second, when you have those quick shutter speeds and quicker, right, your image is gonna have less light. You are getting less light hitting the sensor because the shutter is closing much quicker, okay, right? The opposite can be said for when you increase the shutter speed. When you go to 1/10 of a second, 1/50th of a second, 1/5 of a second, 1 second, right? When you go to those times, you are increasing. You are increasing the amount of time that light is hitting the sensor. You are taking in more light. You are exposing your sensor to more light, right? Because you have more light hitting my boy right here, the sensor, my fingers, the image is going to be brighter. It's going to be more exposed. Okay? Now, we can get into the overexposed, and, you know, there's highlight clipping, and, you know, the shadows are pretty much blacked out, you know, things like that. We can get into that, but I can do like a whole other video with editing and all that stuff, and I can explain these things to you. Okay? But just keep in mind, Quick shutter speeds, less light, darker image. Okay? That's what it does to exposure. Longer shutter speeds, you know, longer seconds, right? More light enters the camera, higher exposure, brighter image. Okay? Now, that's what I covered last video. Took a bit of time, but I'm going into it in depth, whatever that means. Okay? Next part to understand about shutter speed. And, you know, this is something that you got to keep in mind, especially, and I recommend you, all of you, to be doing this, especially if you're in manual mode. You can also be in shutter priority mode. Some cameras have this, where the only setting that you can change on your camera at one time is the shutter, right? And the camera will change everything else for you. But we're not going to do that. I recommend you, at all times, be in manual mode. Okay? I know it's a little daunting, it's a little scary. Be in manual mode. Trust me. I started, you know, with automatic mode. I let the camera do all the work for me. My photos were bad. They were terrible. Okay? But when I switched to manual mode, I struggled. You know, I was like a baby trying to learn how to walk. But when I started walking, that's when I started to learn how to run, right? Good analogy. Okay? So stay in manual mode. You will be thanking me, I don't know how long down the future. You will be thanking me if you stick with this, right? Stay in manual mode if you're learning photography, okay? Because you have all the settings, you have all the power, all the control, okay? And it's important, right? Because that makes you a better photographer. Now, second part of shutter speed that you gotta know. Okay, and this is a weird one to get your mind wrapped around, but then you might be able to understand this. So, the shutter speed that you have, it doesn't only affect your exposure, okay? It doesn't only affect the amount of light you let in. It also affects what happens in your image, all right? So, imagine this, right? If I open and close my shutter very quickly, right, in an instant, right, I am letting in a very small and quick amount of light hitting into my camera. I'm letting it hit the sensor. Very small, but very quick, right? The image that I am going to get is pretty much the exact thing that I have taken a photo of. With no motion blur, if you've seen it in some photos, none of that, okay? My photo is gonna be perfectly sharp, perfectly still, okay? But this only happens at longer exposure times, at shorter shutter speeds, quicker shutter speeds, okay? Now, if I have my shutter speed at like 1 second, 1/10 of a second, and I shake a little bit, you know, while I'm holding the camera, I shake a little bit, what's gonna happen is the light that is entering into the camera and hitting the sensor is going to be wobbled, okay? The wobbling light that enters into your camera, and I'll show you what happens, okay? The light that enters into the camera and hits the sensor is going to be wobbled, okay? It's going to be warped, all right? Especially if you're not keeping your camera still, all right? If you're moving around and you're at a very long shutter speed, your image will be messed up, okay? And this is why you have tripods. You keep it somewhere still, like imagine my arms are a tripod, you keep it somewhere still and you let the camera do whatever you gotta do, but let the tripod hold the camera because I'm shaky, okay? I can't stay still all the time, right? I don't think you can either. It's not really possible. So that's why we have tripods, okay? And I'm gonna show you what happens, right? So if I go to a low shutter speed, let's say, let me pick something real quick, give me 1 second. Let's say I'm taking a photo of this peanut butter, right? Put the peanut butter somewhere. Give me 1 second, guys. Put the peanut butter right there. And I'm going down to let's do 1/100th or 1/250th of a second. 1/250th of a second. Okay? And I'm adjusting my settings as I need to, you know, just to get the good exposure so you can see what's happening. Okay, don't worry about ISO, don't worry about f-stop, I'll explain in another video. Okay, so let me just take the photo, 1/250th of a second. All right, now let me go down to 1 second, or 1/5 of a second, and let me change the ISO, you know, just to make it match, okay? Somewhat match, right? So like 100 ISO. So 1/5 of a second, and I'm gonna show you the difference, okay? Okay. Actually, you know what? Because my hands are very steady, we're going to 1 second. Give me 1 second. All right, 1 second, lower the ISO just a little bit more. So 1 second shutter speed. All right. All right, here we go. So take a look at this. If it's gonna focus. I don't like the A7 III, it does this stuff to me. There you go. All right, this is the photo at 1/250th of a second. I don't know if you can see it clearly, but if you could, it's very sharp. It's pretty much very sharp, you know. There's no like motion blur. There's no like, I'm not getting sick looking at the photo, you know. It's pretty good, right? Pretty sharp. Now, if we go to the second photo, 1 second shutter speed. 1 second. So my shutter's open for 1 second. So any movement that I have in my camera is going to show up in the photo, okay? And I'll show you that right now. Take a look at this, buddy. I don't know if you can see that. Let me see if I can zoom in real quick. My peanut butter. I can't tell if you can see that, but on my end, it is a bit blurry. It is not 100% sharp. It is not the sharpest photo I've ever taken. Okay? By a mile, it is not. Can't tell if you can see it. But there is motion blur. It's a little warped. It's not perfect. Right? It's not sharp. It's not like a knife, you know what I'm saying? So, what I'm telling you is when you are taking a photo and you want it to be crisp, just like you can like, it's like you could, you know, touch the photo and you get like a paper cut or something, you know what I'm saying? Crisp, right? You want it to be perfect, no motion blur, no nothing. You have to go at higher shutter speeds, okay? And this is especially the case when you're taking photos of things that are moving. With things that are moving pretty quickly, you want to go to shutter speeds of about 1/1000th of a second and above, okay? 1/1000th of a second and above, okay? Right? For things that are moving quickly. Why? Because you want to freeze a moment in time and you don't want motion blur. Now, here's where I'm telling you that this is not a rule. This is something you can break. You can always break my rules. You don't have to follow my rules or anyone else's rules because photography is an art, okay? You can have motion blur if that is what you want, if that is what you're looking for in your photos. For me, personally, I don't look for that in my photos all the time. So I always go to shutter speeds above above 1/1000th of a second. So 1/1000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second, 1/3000, 1/4000, 1/8000. Right? So very, very quick. So I could get that moment instantly, get my image very sharp and very clear. Okay? Now, if you're taking a photo, and also just to repeat myself, when you take and keep in mind the effects that this has. If you go to a very quick shutter speed, keep in mind, you will have to change your other settings because you are getting less light into your camera, right? And this is the problem with ISO and f-stops and aperture and being in manual mode, because you need to keep in mind all of the other settings and all the effects that it has on your other, your image, right? And you have to adjust everything just to make sure your photo comes out exactly the way you want it, right? Okay? Now, when would you want to use a very slow shutter speed? When would you want to use a shutter speed of 1 second, 2 seconds, 1/10th of a second, 1/50th of a second, very slow, right? Maybe even at 10 seconds. 10 seconds, you want to keep your shutter up and the sensor exposed. Why would you want to do this? Okay, there are different kinds of photography, all right? In some cases, when you are taking photos, and I don't recommend this all the time, when you are taking photos of still objects, of objects that don't move, don't breathe, don't even blink, okay? Something like this. If it's just like chilling, you know? If you're taking photos of objects that are not moving and you need the extra light, and you know, sometimes you don't want to change your ISO, you want to keep your settings the same, you can sacrifice the shutter speed. You can decrease it, okay? Now, understand the risks, all right? When you go to very low shutter speeds, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, you need a tripod, or you need something to hold the camera super steady, okay? Because any small movement, even a little jitter, is going to mess up your photo. It will. You can try it out right now. Try to stay as still as possible with your camera. It will not come out good. I've done this before. I am not a statue, okay? You are not a statue. You need a tripod or something just to put your camera down, right? To take a photo, okay? And to do it and make the photo as clear and sharp as possible. Now, there are other cases when you would want to use a low shutter speed, okay? Like I said before, you might want motion blur. You might want to show like action, right? To show that there's something going on, something interesting, right? And that's all artistic. That's all your choice. You can make that decision and nobody will be mad at you. Nobody. That's why I love photography, all right? So I could be like, you know, I want to, you know, make the peanut butter run. You know what I'm saying? So 1/50th of a second. Look at that. I don't know if you can tell, but there's a bunch of motion blur going on. Let me see. You can kind of see it, right? It's not sharp at all. I turned my camera while I was taking the photo, right? So I pressed the shutter, and imagine I just pressed the shutter. So I just pressed the shutter, and as it's taking the photo, before the shutter comes back down and ends the photo, I'm moving my camera quickly to make that motion blur, right? To make the image be perceived, to be seen as like something that's action-packed, you know? And you can do that. You can do that. But you have to understand, what effects are you looking for? What do you want in your photos? What are you really looking for, you know? And this is something you got to be thinking while you're going out, if you're doing a photo shoot, you know, if you're doing weddings, if you're doing something. These are things you have to keep in mind, right? Because you're all, look, never go into automatic mode. I'm saying that again. Always stay in manual, okay? And, you know, this goes along with the other rules that cannot be broken, like staying in RAW. Okay, I'll talk about that soon. But let me stop getting ahead of myself, okay? So, you know, there are also other cases, like if you're on like a highway and you want to get trails of light, you can have a very long shutter speed, or very long shutter speed, like 5 seconds. Let cars go by and you can get light trails. Now that's something different, and I might show that photo one time or another. You know, I've done that before, and it's a lot of fun, right? At night, especially. At night, you really want to do it at night. Yeah, I mean, like, that's about it for shutter speed. I mean, those are the two main things you got to pay attention to and keep in mind when you change your shutter speed, okay? Of course, you know, it's going to take some time to really get in your head, right? But over time, it's going to become second nature to you. It will become second nature to you. What shutter speed you're going to need to use in what instant, what moment you need it for, right? How much jitter, how much motion blur do you want in your photo? Do you want your photo to be instant? You go to a very quick shutter speed. If you want motion blur, you go to a bit of a lower shutter speed, but not super low, that the image is so unrecognizable, right? So like somewhere between 1/10 of a second and 1/80th of a second, right? It all depends on your situation, okay? If you want, like I just said, if you want something in an instant, crisp, sharp, you go for the higher, you know, quicker shutter speeds. When I say higher, I mean quicker. When I say lower, I mean longer, right? Like 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, you know, things like that, right? All right, that's about it. If you have any questions, just leave it in the comments below. I'll try to answer them. You know, otherwise, see you next time. Have a good day, all right? You know, have fun taking photos if you have your own camera. Photography is amazing, all right? Have a good one.